more reliable and effective, and they were soon rolling off the production lines in huge numbers. Together with aircraft and mobile artillery, they set the continuous front in motion. The Germans were the first to make the combination work, overrunning most of Western Europe in a lightning attack in 1940. But by 1943, when the German army was deep in Russia, the front had grown to a monster that dwarfed its World War I predecessor.
This trench is not from the First World War. It was part of the Soviet defenses near Kursk in 1943. A deep belt of many trenches, minefields, bunkers, gun positions, and tank traps, extending back almost 100 miles from the front, designed to soak up and slow down and eventually stop exactly the kind of armored attack that had been so successful in 1940. A lot of Germans weren't in favor of attacking here at all. Heinz Guderian, Hitler's leading tank expert, asked, "How many people do you think even know where Kursk is?" But in the end, the Germans did attack here and started one of the largest battles the world has ever seen.
More than 2 million men fought in the Battle of Kursk, together with 6,000 tanks and 30,000 pieces of artillery. The fighting lasted 50 days, and when it was over, the tank no longer seemed an easy solution to anybody's military problem. And for the civilians who lived in the path of the moving front, tank warfare was a disaster.
This city's 400 years old, but like half the towns in Russia, there's hardly a building in it over 40. Before the German army occupied Belgorod in October 1941, 34,000 people lived here. The first time the tanks went through, there was 2 days of fighting here, but most of the buildings and most of the citizens survived. That time, Belgorod was lucky.
But it didn't stay lucky. Belgorod was liberated by Soviet troops after 20 months, but then the Germans retook it, and by the time the Russians freed it again after the Battle of Kursk, only 150 of Belgorod's 34,000 people were left. The rest were refugees, conscripts, or dead.
What happened here happened to tens of thousands of other towns and villages, especially in Eastern Europe. Of the 40 million people who were killed in the Second World War, 5 times as many as the First, 30 million died on the Eastern Front. It was the biggest land war in history, and the first war in modern times where the civilian dead outnumbered the military. Belgorod had no military importance, it just got in the way. The front ground across it 4 times, and it was practically extinguished. Tanks and other killing machines had broken the trench stalemate and set the continuous front into motion. But that just made warfare worse.
Yet the citizens of Belgorod died almost accidentally, because the war was fought where they lived. Elsewhere, civilians were being killed on purpose. It was the final step in the brutal logic of total war. If the civilians producing the weapons of war were now the real foundation of a nation's armed strength, then they were actually the most important target of all. And the first attempt to hit that target directly was made almost as soon as total war became a reality, back in 1915.
This pub is called the Dolphin. It's in Red Lion Street, right in the center of London. And it was here on September 9th, 1915, that the 20th century really got underway. First World War was already a year old then, and over 1 million soldiers were already dead. But when the regulars started flocking in here after work that Wednesday evening, the old world, the world where soldiers were soldiers and civilians were civilians, that was still alive. About the same time, Zeppelin L-13 left the North German coast under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Matti. At 20 to 9, when the second wave of drinkers were already well dug in here at the Dolphin and what was left of the first wave were sinking fast, Matti crossed the English coast into Lincolnshire. About 10:40, he dropped a few bombs in the North London suburb of Golders Green and then continued south until he reached Russell Square, about 300 yards from here. Then his crew began absolutely shoveling the bombs out from a height of about 8,000 feet. They fell in Bedford Place, in Queen Square, Osmond Yard, Lamb's Conduit Passage, and then right outside this door. The front blew in, the roof came down, and there were 17 dead and injured people lying under the rubble. The 20th century had arrived. It was a tiny raid by later standards, but it was the precedent for Rotterdam, for Dresden, for Hiroshima, for all the innocent cities that have been destroyed from the air in the 20th century. What died here in 1915, besides a few unlucky patrons, was the distinction between soldiers and civilians. After the Dolphin, everybody was a legitimate target.
The first reaction to civilized countries making deliberate attacks on enemy civilians was utter horror. After the first Zeppelin raids on London, the New York Times commented that it was a shameful, brutal way of making war. The London Times, which had bombs fall within a few hundred yards of its offices, took a harder line, calling Germany the Jack the Ripper of nations. The civilians who now found themselves the targets of the war effort were less astounded and outraged than their leaders. The Zeppelins appear to cause wonderfully little panic at the moment of murder and no permanent panic afterwards, observed the Times. Zeppelins were a curiosity, and when the first one was shot down, 100,000 Londoners made the trip 15 miles out of town to see it. There was a controversy about how the dead crew should be buried. Were they honorable soldiers fighting the enemy, or just baby killers? In the end, outrage lost out to tradition, and they received full military honors.
Bombing didn't really do much damage in the First World War. The bombs weren't very powerful, and hitting the target was largely a matter of chance. But the potential was obviously there. And between the wars, the military theorists got to work on the idea. The most influential of them, an Italian general called Giulio Due, wrote in 1921 that in a future war, the disintegration of nations will be accomplished by aerial forces. He believed that the most important target in war was now the civilian population of the enemy state. And the only way to attack them directly was to leap across the battle lines and hold fleets of aircraft and drop enormous quantities of bombs on them.
The authorities were worried. Bomb shelters were developed, and they worked, too, always provided the bombs didn't explode too close. In London, they rehearsed ways for dealing with a scenario that predicted casualties of almost nuclear proportions. Making coffins for so many dead would cost too much, so the government planned mass graves and burning with quicklime. When the Second World War came, hospitals were cleared of their patients, mainly to make way for the psychiatric casualties.